Why isn't it important to establish mutual trust between mobile app providers and mobile app users?
Well, I think that's fairly simple. If I didn't trust my bank, I wouldn't give them my money.
But how are you establishing the trust? How is sort of like making sure that the users are feeling and understand that trust?
Well, I think there's a lot of different mechanisms in play here. And a lot of this comes from you need to show the user that you have the correct security mechanisms in place, that you are prioritizing the correct aspects here, and this comes, it's kind of the piece that we are referring to is of course authentication and authorization piece, which we talked a lot about, but it's also about kind of the privacy aspects and all the other things that shows the end user here that you are thinking about his best interest.
But it's also about, when I'm doing a large money transaction, I might not be comfortable with a low level of security. For example, a one-factor authentication, device authentication. You might want to add several layers of security there. And their Signicat mobile ID have sort of like we can lay several sort of like chain layers of security.
I know you're touching on a really important aspect because kind of if you go back a few years, it was very much, at least here in the Nordics, very much full two-factor authentication, very heavy-handed security on everything because it needed to be secure. And what we see today is that you need to have a much more flexible approach to it. So you kind of evaluate the risk of the transaction and adapt the security aspects to the transaction risk.
I think we're talking about proportional security to the risk that you're doing.
Exactly. You need to not hassle the user more, and kind of I would be bloody annoyed if my bank required me to do heavy-handed authentication every time I was paying 10 NOK for the Coke I was buying at the corner store. But if I'm paying for a new apartment, I'm definitely willing to accept some hassle because I expect some hassle. If I wasn't hassled enough, I would think this was unsecure.
So to tie back to the mutual trust, I mean, like when you're logging onto the mobile banking app, a one-factor device authentication might be enough. But when you're doing a large money transaction, you like to add several layers of security. So that's sort of like the proportional security that we can provide.
Yeah, I think it's not just from a security aspect, but from a trust aspect, from kind of having the user trust your application means that you need to be able to actually show him that you are taking more care when you do high-value transaction or high-risk transaction than you do when you do normal. Kind of, you need to show him that you are actually have a conscious relationship to the risk and the value of the transaction.
Okay, André, mobile app trust and engagement can easily end up on a collision course. How to avoid it and turn it to a winning concept?
Yeah, I think we touched up a little bit on it on the last question, but of course it's very tempting to just create the vision of as a secure solution as possible. You end up having very heavy-handed security on everything because then it's perceived as very, very secure. It also ends up being very, very unusable.
But it end up being an obstacle instead of sort of something that's helping you.
It becomes an obstacle. And that's, as we talked about, that's why you need to have that proportional security for the transaction risk and value. And if you can get to the point of actually having that proportional security there, you end up giving the user a really good user experience, but at the same time as you show him that you have good security in the solution. And that is something that can differentiate you from the competition.
Okay, André, why do you need focus on continuous trust development and how can it be achieved?
Well, I think a key aspect here is that the marketplace is continually changing, and in particular on the mobile, stuff is happening so fast. If you just look back a few years, kind of, we had the various biometric options coming, and they are continually adding new options and new features to it, and the users are changing. I think on average, 40% of the users are changing their device every year. And that means that all of these new elements that's coming into the market is getting spread very fast, and a lot of the users are kind of getting taught to use that, and you need to keep up with all of that.
But how do we tie that to continuous trust development for the user?
Well, I think an important aspect here is that if you were still using the PIN code that was kind of the common authentication mechanism of the device, 7 or 8 years back, if that was still your app authentication mechanism, then users wouldn't trust you anymore.
And we do know that PIN code is good, but it might not be as good because you have shoulder surfing. But with biometric solutions, it's much easier, and you can can mitigate those, for example, shoulder surfing.
And that's kind of just the most obvious and most visible example, because under the hood there's a lot of stuff going on. The threat landscape is changing, the mobile platforms is changing, and you need to show that you're actually on top of all of this and moving with this. And some things are more visible to the end user, but of course, if you have problems because you're not leveraging the latest mechanism and other banks don't, it might also end up not something that the user necessarily sees, but as headlines in the newspapers, and that's also something you want to avoid. So that you kind of need to be on top of all of this mechanism and continually develop with it. But that's kind of that's the underlying security development. When it comes to the trust development, you also have the aspect of when I first install an app, I have an idea about why I'm installing it, but I haven't used it anything, and depending on the brand recognition of the company, I might not even know that much of the company. And through my use of the mobile app, I will gradually, if I use this every day, say for paying for coffee at the coffee shop or for something else, I will gradually build trust as I just use it. And that's a different kind of trust builder.
And I think that's a key point there, because the more you use the app, the more you use our solution, over time you're building up more and more security, because you know more and more about the user, and you can actually start trusting the user more.
Yeah, and the user also gets a higher and higher degree of trust in the app if he perceives it as secure and user-friendly and nothing happens. Then if he's used it for a year, then he has a fairly good degree of trust in it, because he's been used, and that can kind of get the user to be willing to take that step and buy other services in the app. I have to admit, my latest apartment loan, I had that mobile banking app on my device and was using it for almost a year before I moved my loan application in there. And that was simply because it was one of the neobanks with a very fancy and nice UI, but
you didn't really trust it.
No, it wasn't one of their big names, so I wanted to have that.
So I think that is a key takeaway. It takes time to build trust, specifically with new fancy security mechanisms. You need to get used to them, and that's one of our challenges, that we need to get the user to trust them.